The quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound cutting through the soft chatter in the restaurant. It was a warm evening in Charleston, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The lights in the venue had been dimmed just enough to create a soft glow over the tables set with fine china, crystal glasses, and white linens. A wedding rehearsal dinner was underway, the calm before the storm of tomorrow's grand ceremony. Claire moved through the room with practiced ease, her tray balanced perfectly against her shoulder as she weaved between the guests. She had been working here for years now, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant becoming as much a part of her as the worn apron she always tied snugly around her waist. The guests were fine, the evening predictable, just another night in a job she had grown accustomed to. But then she saw them, Rebecca and her entourage. Rebecca, the bride, was a figure many would describe as the very image of perfection. Tall, with long blonde hair cascading in soft waves down her back, she exuded confidence and beauty. To anyone else, she might have seemed like the type of person one would want to be around, successful, beautiful, effortlessly poised. But Claire had seen through the facade. Over the course of many shifts, she had witnessed Rebecca's true colors: condescending, dismissive, and entitled. And tonight it was no different. Claire watched from a distance as Rebecca held court with her bridesmaids, her voice loud and shrill above the chatter of the other guests. There was an almost cruel joy in the way she spoke, as if every word was meant to remind others of her superiority. Claire wasn't offended by it, not exactly, but she couldn't help but notice the little things. The way Rebecca flicked her wrist when she made a request, the little sneer she kept in place when something didn't go exactly as she wanted. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. As Claire approached the table with a fresh bottle of wine for the bride's table, she saw Rebecca glance up at her from across the room. It was a brief moment of eye contact, but it felt like a punch. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't quite kind. "Maid of honor," she called out sharply, not even bothering to make sure the waitstaff was within earshot. "Tell her to make sure I'm not served by her." The words landed like a slap. Claire didn't flinch. She simply set the bottle down on the table and moved away without a word. She had expected this. Maybe not in such a direct manner, but she'd been in enough high-end restaurants to know the unspoken dynamics. She had been ignored and dismissed before. This was different. This wasn't just a glance of disdain or a comment under her breath. This was a deliberate attempt to make Claire feel small. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, a mix of anger and humiliation swirling inside her. But she didn't let it show. Claire had learned a long time ago to keep her face unreadable, to hide the emotion and the hurt behind a practiced mask. She had grown up with this kind of treatment, but she had never learned to like it. Walking into the kitchen, Claire's breath escaped in a sharp sigh. The back of her neck tingled, a wave of heat running down her spine as she dropped her tray onto the counter with a soft clink. She stood there for a moment, eyes closed, taking slow, measured breaths. She could feel the faint throb of her pulse in her ears, a reminder of just how deeply Rebecca's words had stung. But there was no room for weakness here, no room for emotions that would cloud her judgment. "You okay, Han?" Gina's voice broke through her thoughts. She had been working at the restaurant for years, long enough to know when something was bothering Claire. She peered at her from the sink, where she was scrubbing dishes, her worn face soft with concern. Claire nodded but didn't speak. She couldn't say the words out loud, couldn't give voice to the shame that was welling up inside her. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, grabbing a fresh tray to restock drinks. "You know it's not about you, right?" Gina continued, drying her hands with a dish towel as she set it down. "She's just a spoiled brat with too much time and money on her hands. You just do your job and don't let it get to you." Claire didn't answer. She was used to the sympathy, to the reassurances that people often gave when they noticed something wasn't quite right. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate it. It was just that it didn't change anything. This was her life, and she had learned long ago that the only person who could change it was herself. She couldn't rely on others to lift her up. Not when every day, She faced the weight of her own insecurities. Taking a steadying breath, Claire walked back out into the dining room, her steps silent but sure. The laughter and chatter filled the air again, but to Claire, the sounds seemed muffled now. It was as though the world outside her was moving at a pace she could no longer keep up with. Her eyes flicked to Rebecca's table again, and she saw the bride glance up at her, this time with more malice. The bridesmaids were giggling among themselves, whispering behind their hands, no doubt about her. Rebecca gave a slight nod, and Claire understood the unspoken message. She wasn't wanted here, but something inside Claire stirred. A quiet resolve started to settle over her. She wouldn't back down. Not this time. With practiced calm, she moved to the table and began to clear empty plates, doing so as efficiently and quietly as possible. The tension between her and Rebecca was palpable, but Claire held her composure, focusing only on the task in front of her. Just before she turned to leave the table, she caught Rebecca's eyes again. This time, Rebecca's smile wasn't quite as smug. There was a flicker of something else there. Perhaps uncertainty, perhaps doubt. For a moment, it almost felt like the whole room had stilled. But Claire didn't linger. She moved away from the table, disappearing into the kitchen once more. The air inside the kitchen was cooler, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She felt it again, the quiet but fierce strength building within her, the desire to prove something, not to Rebecca, but to herself. For so long, Claire had let people like Rebecca hold power over her. They had belittled her, assumed she would never amount to anything. But tonight, something had changed. The night was still young, but Claire could already feel the shift inside her. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not to herself, at least. Claire stood by the kitchen window, watching the gentle ebb of the Charleston night. It was the same window she'd stood by countless times before, the one that framed the quiet streets, the rhythm of life outside that seemed so far away. She felt a strange comfort in its familiarity, the dull sound of the traffic and the murmur of the streetlights providing the background noise to her thoughts. It had always been this way, hadn't it? A constant cycle of work, quiet moments of reflection, and the slow march toward something bigger, something better. But for years, it had always felt just out of reach. She wiped her hands on the apron, still clasped around her waist, the fabric worn from years of use. It wasn't just the apron that was worn. It was her. Her soul, her heart, had been eroded bit by the things people said to her, the looks they gave her when they assumed she was nothing more than the help. As she stood there, looking at the dimly lit street, Claire remembered the first time she had truly felt invisible. She was 12 years old, living in a cramped apartment with her mother in the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. Her father had long since disappeared from their lives, a shadow of a man who had never lived up to the responsibilities of being a father. It was just Claire and her mom, a team. Claire's mother, June, worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses and waiting tables, just to make sure they had enough. Claire didn't mind the struggle. She was proud of her mom, proud of the way she made everything work, even if it meant missing dinner or having to do without. But Claire remembered the looks from the other kids at school, the ones that came from the other parents when they saw her mother at the supermarket, pushing a cart filled with canned goods and bread. Her mother, though beautiful in her own way, never quite fit the mold of the perfect, polished mothers that the other kids had. Claire saw how the other children noticed, how they sneered behind her back, making fun of her mom's shoes, or the way she spoke with a slight drawl. Claire had never spoken up. She had learned early that silence was safer than confrontation. But the shame, the sting of feeling like they were always on the outside looking in, never left her. It followed her home, followed her into school, into every room she entered. She never understood why people looked at them as if they were somehow less than. But her mother always had a way of soothing her fears, a way of showing her how to rise above the smallness of others. "There's dignity in everything we do, Claire," her mother would say, her voice calm but firm, as they sat together in their small kitchen after a long day. "You don't have to be anything other than who you are. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Claire had taken those words with her, carrying them like a heavy weight, unsure of what they meant until years later. But now, standing in the kitchen of the restaurant, watching the guests laugh and drink and live their lives as though they were untouched by the world's harshness, Claire began to understand her mother's words in a different way. It wasn't just about enduring the hardship, it was about finding a way to own it. To own herself, even if the world around her refused to acknowledge her worth. She remembered her first job. She had been 14, scrubbing dishes in a local diner. She could still smell the grease on her hands, the faint scent of bleach mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee and eggs frying on the stove. Her mother had been so proud of her, though Claire had never understood why. "You're going to learn what it means to work for what you have," June had said, her voice heavy with wisdom. And work she did. She worked hard, moving from job to job, never giving up, never backing down. But even as she worked, the world around her continued to pass her by. There was always something missing, always something unattainable. She watched as people her age went to college, built families, found success. And Claire? She worked at the same restaurants, in the same low-paying jobs, her face becoming familiar to the regulars but unnoticed by everyone else. The hours were long, and the shifts were tiring, but there was a strange satisfaction in the repetition. She'd learned to disappear into the rhythm of it all. By the time Claire was 25, her mother had passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack, one of those silent killers that takes you without warning. Claire had been working that night, the way she always did, when the call came. The sound of the phone ringing in the back office had felt wrong. The voice on the other end too frantic, too urgent. By the time she had made it to the hospital, her mother was gone. There was no time for grief, no time for anything. She had to take care of things. There were bills to pay, arrangements to make. And the funeral, oh, the funeral. She could still hear the voice of the funeral director, kind but detached, offering her the condolences she couldn't fully process. They were strangers, all of them, strangers who thought they knew her story, but didn't know half of it. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and visits from distant relatives who barely knew her mother. It wasn't until months later, when Claire was alone in her apartment, sorting through her mother's belongings, that she came across the letter. It was tucked away in the back of a drawer, hidden beneath old receipts and forgotten mementos. Her mother's will. Claire had never expected much. They had never had much. But when she opened the letter, something inside her shifted. Her mother had left her everything. The apartment, the savings, and a list of instructions that Claire could barely comprehend. But there was one line that stood out above all the others. "For you, Claire, this is your chance. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. Take this, and don't ever apologize for who you've become." For the first time in her life, Claire had felt like she wasn't invisible. Like she wasn't just another person in the background, another face in the crowd. It was her chance to build something for herself, to stop living in the shadows of other people's expectations. But it wasn't easy. The will had left her with a legacy, yes, but it hadn't come with an instruction manual. The money wasn't enough to start over, not in the way she had hoped. The bills kept coming, the rent was due, and her life at the restaurant hadn't changed. But there was something about the words her mother had left behind that had stayed with her. "Don't apologize for who you've become." Claire didn't know it yet, but the quiet, humbling words would become the foundation of her journey. A journey that would take her to this moment, standing in the restaurant, faced with the woman who had underestimated her. As Claire turned back toward the kitchen door, she felt the familiar weight of her mother's words in her chest. The restaurant was full of people, full of noise, but at that moment, it was just Claire, and she was ready to stop hiding. The restaurant was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint hum of conversations, the buzz of a rehearsal dinner before the grand day. Claire moved through it like she always did, fluidly, unnoticed, the hum of the room blending with the rhythm of her every step. The warmth of the evening pressed in from the outside, but inside, the atmosphere was cool and controlled, just like the countless nights before. Yet, tonight, everything felt different. There was a weight in the air, a tension she couldn't shake. She'd felt it the moment Rebecca walked in. The bride, all radiant confidence and sharp edges, had entered the restaurant with her entourage, her presence cutting through the room like a knife. Her heels clicked on the wooden floor, echoing louder than the chatter around her. Rebecca was the kind of person who never had to say much. Her presence did all the talking. And as she walked in, Claire knew she'd be forced to work harder tonight. Not because of the demands of the job, but because of Rebecca herself. It wasn't just the way Rebecca looked at her, though that in itself was enough to make Claire want to shrink into the shadows. It was the way Rebecca carried herself. Everything about her screamed entitlement. The way she pushed people aside, how she flicked her wrist when she wanted attention, how she raised her voice when she didn't get it. She was used to being in charge, and the world around her bent to her will. And tonight, Rebecca's world would revolve around her. Her dream wedding, her perfect night. But that didn't mean Claire had to play along. Claire caught sight of the bride again, laughing with her bridesmaids, the sound high-pitched and shrill, the kind that grated on the nerves after a while. Rebecca was enjoying herself. Yes, but there was a sharpness to her laughter, a hidden edge that Claire couldn't quite ignore. The bride's entourage was the same. Beautiful, polished, perfect. Claire knew the type, the kind who had everything handed to them. They were the ones who never had to ask for anything. They simply took what they wanted. It wasn't long before Claire was called to serve at the bride's table. She approached the group with a practiced grace, her steps light but deliberate. The moment she reached the table, Rebecca glanced up at her with that signature look of disdain, as if she had just been interrupted by an annoyance. "Are we supposed to be served by her?" Rebecca asked her maid of honor with a loud laugh, her voice carrying over the hum of the room. The comment hung in the air, the words biting into Claire's skin. She paused, feeling a surge of heat rise in her chest, but she kept her face neutral, a polite smile on her lips as she refilled the glasses on the table, avoiding Rebecca's gaze. "I'm sorry, is there something wrong?" Claire asked, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "You're not going to serve me, are you?" she sneered. "I don't want her touching my glass." Claire's breath hitched, but she didn't show it. Instead, she took a slow step back, feeling the sting of Rebecca's words seep deep into her. For a split second, she almost let the words hit her hard. But then, just as quickly, she let it slide away, slipping into the calmness she had mastered. "No worries," Claire said, her voice softer now, deliberately calm. "I'll send someone else over." She turned to walk away, keeping her back straight, her head high. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the words or the humiliation of being dismissed, treated like she was nothing more than the air between them. But she knew one thing for certain. Rebecca's disdain was only going to make her stronger. In the kitchen, Claire paused by the sink, her hand hovering over the cool water as she tried to steady herself. She could feel the heat of the moment still, like it was wrapping itself around her chest, squeezing the breath from her. She thought back to her mother, her wisdom echoing in her mind. "Don't ever apologize for who you are." Claire squeezed her eyes shut, breathing in deeply. Her mother had known what it meant to be underestimated, to be brushed aside, but she had never let it define her. Her mother had been strong in the quietest ways, always putting others first but never allowing anyone to make her feel less than she was. Now Claire understood what her mother had meant all those years ago. The moments of humiliation were not a reflection of who she was, but of the limitations others imposed on her. And tonight, Rebecca had just given her a chance to prove that she could rise above it. Back in the dining room, Claire's movements were more deliberate now. She carried each tray with more purpose, every plate placed with intention. She smiled when asked, her voice calm, even as Rebecca's piercing gaze followed her every movement. But inside, Claire was shifting. The pieces were falling into place. She knew what she had to do. The night went on, the wedding rehearsal dinner a series of quiet exchanges, with Claire moving in and out of the room, delivering food and drinks with practiced professionalism. The tension between her and Rebecca simmered but never boiled over, each moment passing like a quiet storm. She avoided Rebecca's direct line of sight, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. It was as if Rebecca knew that Claire's presence was more than just a waitress. It was a symbol of something greater. Claire's own inner battle raged on. The quiet, simmering anger she had learned to control for years was starting to creep to the surface. How many times had she been overlooked, underestimated? How many times had she let the actions of others dictate her own self-worth? Tonight wasn't going to be one of those times. As the night wore on, Claire made her way to the back of the restaurant. The cool air of the kitchen, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat of the dining room. She leaned against the counter, staring down at her hands. At that moment, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let Rebecca's cruelty define her. She wasn't going to let her passively retreat into the shadows anymore. Claire had something to say, and tonight was the night she was going to say it. The DJ's voice crackled over the speaker, announcing that it was time for a toast. The room quieted down, all eyes on Rebecca, the bride, as she stood to give her speech. Claire could feel the weight of the moment, a quiet anticipation filling the room as Rebecca raised her glass, ready to speak. But then, something unexpected happened. As Claire moved to the side of the room, she caught sight of the microphone, still standing on its stand, waiting to be used. In that instant, she knew what she had to do. With slow, deliberate steps, Claire walked across the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Rebecca's voice faltered for a moment as she looked at Claire, her surprise quickly masked by a sharp smile. "What are you doing here?" Claire didn't answer. She took the mic, the weight of it surprisingly heavy in her hands. She could feel every eye in the room on her, could hear the rustle of whispers as people exchanged puzzled looks. Then Claire spoke. Her voice was quiet at first, but it carried across the room. "I wasn't supposed to be the one to serve you tonight. But tonight, I'm going to tell you something you never saw coming." Rebecca's face paled slightly, but she remained silent, the room holding its breath. With a slow, steady breath, Claire began reading aloud from the letter her mother had left her. A letter that spoke of legacy, of strength, and of a woman who had never been seen for what she truly was. As Claire spoke, her words filled the space with a quiet power. The room fell silent. Every eye was on her now. The restaurant was quieter now, the atmosphere thick with the weight of Claire's words. The guests who had been enjoying their wine and laughter a few minutes ago now sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on Claire as she stood at the front of the room. The microphone in her hand felt heavier now, as if it was no longer just a tool for speaking. It was a symbol, a conduit for something deeper, something far more personal. As she continued to read the letter from her mother, Claire could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had imagined this moment countless times, in the quiet corners of her mind where she allowed herself to dream of defiance, of standing up to the forces that had tried to diminish her. But never had it felt so real, so raw. The words her mother had written felt like a bridge from the past, connecting Claire to a woman who had never been truly seen, but had built a life of quiet strength. And now, here Claire was, standing in front of people who had never truly seen her, about to let them know exactly who she was. "And this is the chance, Claire," she read, her voice steady but carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of silence. "This is the moment when you will stop apologizing for your existence. When you will no longer shrink to make others feel comfortable. The world will try to make you invisible, but you were never meant to be. Stand tall, stand proud, and take this gift for what it is." She paused for a moment, letting the silence settle in the room, letting the words linger. The guests looked at each other, some unsure of what to make of it, others simply stunned by the boldness of what was happening. Rebecca sat frozen at her table, her face a mask of disbelief. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time that night, she looked vulnerable, like the world she had built for herself had cracked just enough for her to feel a glimpse of something raw, something real. But Claire didn't look at her. She couldn't. This was not about Rebecca. This was about Claire, finally understanding her own worth, her own voice. Claire's thoughts drifted, and her mind wandered to the past, back to when she was younger and felt the sting of being overlooked. She was 16 when it first hit her, how different her life was from the others. Her classmates went to fancy birthday parties, wore new clothes, and talked about their family vacations in places Claire could only dream of. She remembered sitting at the back of class, her hand raised for an answer that never came, while the other students around her carried on, their voices filling the room like it was theirs to dominate. Her mother had always told her to rise above it, but Claire didn't always know how. Sometimes, she felt like she was just a shadow in the corner of a room, existing only in the periphery, always overlooked. She had to fight for every ounce of attention, fight for respect in a world that seemed to give it only to those who had already been given so much. It wasn't just at school, though. It was in every part of her life. When Claire first started working at the restaurant, she remembered how the other servers treated her as if she were invisible. They'd make jokes about the way she looked or whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. She had learned to block it out, to keep her head down and do her job, because that was all she knew how to do. Work, do it well, be quiet. Her mother had never spoken directly about the struggles they faced, but Claire saw it in the way her mom carried herself. Always proud, even when the world gave her no reason to be. It was in the way her mother smiled through the exhaustion, always telling Claire that she had the ability to rise, to be more than just what people saw. And now, Claire could feel that rising deep within her. All those years of silence, of being pushed aside, were leading up to this. The pressure that had built up inside her, like a slow burn of suppressed emotion, was now bubbling to the surface. No longer would she be the one who shrank into the background. No longer would she be the one who took the insults, the judgments, and the slights without speaking up. This was her moment. Rebecca's silent fury simmered behind her perfect facade, but Claire couldn't focus on that. The tension in the room was palpable now, the guests sensing the shift in energy. Some of them seemed unsure of how to react, unsure of how to reconcile what they had witnessed. This quiet, determined woman reading from a letter that made her seem like someone they hadn't expected, someone far more complex than the image they had painted of her. The maid of honor, a woman with bright red lips and a steady gaze, leaned toward Rebecca and whispered something in her ear. Claire could see Rebecca's shoulders tense, her posture shifting with discomfort. But still, she didn't speak. She didn't argue. Claire's mind raced as she finished the letter, her voice unwavering as she spoke the last words her mother had written. You are not invisible. Your worth is not defined by others. They may never understand you, but that is not your burden to carry. Live for yourself, Claire. Live as you were meant to. The finality of it hit Claire all at once, and she felt something inside her click, like a lock had been undone, releasing a weight that had held her down for so long. She was standing there, in front of Rebecca and the others, unashamed, unafraid. And as the words hung in the air, Claire realized something. She was not just speaking to Rebecca. She was speaking to herself. She was giving herself permission to stop hiding, to stop apologizing for her existence. The room stayed silent for a long time after Claire finished reading. No one spoke. The only sound that filled the space was the soft clink of glasses on the tables, the sound of time itself stretching and bending under the weight of what had just happened. Claire set the microphone back down on its stand, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer energy of what she had just done. She had never been this vulnerable in front of people before, never allowed herself to stand on this stage, to be this open. But now, she felt like she had nothing left to hide. This was who she was. This was her truth. Rebecca still hadn't spoken. Her face was ashen, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for some way to regain control. But it was too late for that. Claire had taken her power back. Claire turned to walk away, her movements slow but deliberate. The applause came first softly, unsure at first, but then it built, like a gentle tide rising until it became a full roar of appreciation. It wasn't the kind of applause one would expect at a rehearsal dinner. It wasn't loud or showy, but it was there, and it was real. Claire kept walking, but in that moment, she understood something. She had just taken back more than her power. She had taken back her identity. Back in the kitchen, Claire leaned against the counter, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She felt dizzy from the adrenaline. Her hands were clammy, and her heart still raced in her chest. But there was a new calmness inside her, a sense of peace she hadn't known she was missing. She had crossed a line tonight, and though she wasn't sure what would happen next, she knew one thing for sure: she would never be invisible again. The applause was soft, but it carried with it the weight of something monumental. It wasn't the kind of applause one would expect from a formal rehearsal dinner, where people clinked glasses and offered polite congratulations. No, this was different. This was real. This was for Claire, the woman who had spent her life quietly moving through the shadows of other people's expectations, finally stepping into the light. But even as she heard the claps, even as the guests around her began to murmur their approval, Claire didn't linger. She didn't bask in the moment. She simply turned and walked out of the room, her heart still racing, her body trembling from the weight of everything she had just done. The kitchen was quiet, almost too quiet, as Claire slipped behind the swinging door. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft clink of dishes being scrubbed, and the distant sound of music from the dining room were all that filled the space now. She leaned against the counter, closing her eyes for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of oil and lemon-scented cleaning products. This was her world. It always has been. But tonight, it felt different. Her hands shook as she set the microphone down on the counter, the weight of the moment still sinking in. She had read the letter. She had told them who she was. And now she felt a strange sense of freedom, a release. The weight she had carried for so long, of being invisible, of feeling overlooked, had lightened, even if only for a moment. But there was something else. A deeper, quieter voice was echoing in her mind. "You've taken the first step, Claire. Now what?" The question lingered, unanswered. She had stood up for herself. But now the real work began. The journey was just starting. Back in the dining room, the mood had shifted. The laughter had died down, replaced by hushed conversations and the sound of silverware tapping against plates. Rebecca had not spoken a word since Claire's bold reading, her face frozen in a look of stunned disbelief. But she wasn't the only one affected. Elaine, the woman who had served Claire for the past few years, was the first to approach her in the kitchen. She was an older woman, with hands that had spent decades kneading dough, scrubbing dishes, and smoothing out wrinkles from life. Her eyes were warm, always kind, but tonight they were full of something different: respect. "You did good, kid," she said softly, her voice gruff but full of admiration. "I didn't know you had that in you." Claire looked at Elaine, a small smile pulling at the corners of her lips. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Elaine nodded, pulling Claire into a brief hug. It was a quiet moment, but in that hug, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years: a sense of belonging. It wasn't the validation of Rebecca or the guests, but the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had seen her struggle, seen her work, and had quietly witnessed her transformation. "You've got more in you than you know," Elaine added, pulling back with a small chuckle. "Now go take a breather. You deserve it." Claire walked into the small break room, a tiny oasis away from the bustle of the restaurant. The air was different here, cooler, calmer. It was as if the world outside had momentarily paused, just long enough for her to catch her breath. She sank into the worn leather chair, leaning her head back and closing her eyes. The weight of the moment still hung heavy in the air, and she could feel the adrenaline slowly leaving her body. But despite the rush of emotions that had just surged through her, there was something else, a quiet sense of peace. She had spoken the truth. She had let the world know exactly who she was, what she was worth. And though she knew the journey was far from over, she had taken the first step towards something bigger. As she sat there, her thoughts drifted back to her mother. The letter she had read aloud in the dining room had been more than just a will. It had been a message, one her mother had left for her, even though she never knew she would need it. Her mother had always been the quiet force in their lives, the steady anchor that kept them grounded, even when the world tried to pull them apart. And now, Claire realized, she was carrying that legacy with her. She had always thought she had to be something she wasn't, to be loved, to be seen. She had always thought she had to remain in the background, invisible and silent, to to avoid the ridicule, the rejection, and the shame. But tonight, she had learned that wasn't true. She didn't have to apologize for who she was. Her mother had taught her that without even realizing it. Claire opened her eyes, a small but determined smile curling at her lips. She wasn't invisible anymore, and now that she had taken this first step, there was no going back. Back in the dining room, Rebecca was still at her table, her face a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something Claire couldn't quite place. She sat there, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, as if trying to hold onto some shred of control. But it was clear to everyone now that she had lost it. The calm, perfect facade that she had spent so long building was cracking, and all the guests who had once hung on her every word were now watching her, waiting for her to respond. But Rebecca didn't respond. She remained silent, the quiet anger bubbling beneath the surface, but not enough to make her speak. And then Claire saw it, just a flicker, but it was enough. In that moment, Claire saw the fear in Rebecca's eyes. Fear not of being overshadowed, but of being revealed. Because what Claire had just done wasn't just stand up for herself. It was a revelation, one that exposed the facade of perfection Rebecca had so carefully built. Claire had peeled away the layers, and now Rebecca had nowhere to hide. Outside the restaurant, the night air was cool, the soft rustle of the trees a welcome sound after the heat of the dinner. Claire stepped outside, her hands in her pockets, her breath coming in slow, measured rhythms. The night felt different now. Everything felt different. She had done it. She had stood in front of those people, in front of Rebecca, and said what needed to be said. She wasn't afraid anymore. And though the world outside still carried the weight of its judgments, Claire felt for the first time like she could stand tall within it. She wasn't invisible. But even as she walked away, she knew the real work had just begun. There would be more moments like tonight. More times when she would have to choose to rise above, to claim her space in a world that wanted to ignore her. But for the first time, she didn't feel afraid of what that would mean. She didn't feel afraid of herself. Because Claire had learned something that night. The power to be seen, to be heard, and to take control was always hers. She just needed to realize it. The aftermath of the evening's events seemed to settle over the restaurant like a heavy fog. The guests had gradually dispersed, some exchanging nervous glances, others muttering quiet apologies for the tension that had filled the room. But Claire didn't care about any of that. The night had been a revelation, not just to the people around her, but to herself. She was no longer the woman who slinked into the background, no longer the one who felt the sting of rejection and did nothing but take it. No, tonight, Claire had claimed her space. It had been a strange sensation, standing there in front of the mic, her mother's words spilling out for everyone to hear. She had always thought of herself as invisible. She had always thought her value was determined by others, by how they saw her. But now, with each passing minute, she began to understand. Her worth didn't come from their eyes. It came from her own understanding of herself. As Claire walked through the now quiet restaurant, she felt the weight of the evening's events hanging in the air. She knew that what had happened tonight wasn't just a moment in time. It was a shift that had begun the moment Rebecca had dismissed her and that had culminated in Claire taking the mic. What she hadn't expected was that the night's revelations would extend beyond just the people in the room. She had begun to uncover something deeper within herself, something she hadn't yet fully understood. Rebecca sat back in her chair, her fingers clutching the edge of the table like lifelines. The wedding rehearsal dinner had been, in her mind, her night, a night that was supposed to be about her. Everything had been planned down to the last detail. She had spent months preparing for this, curating every moment to be perfect. And then Claire, the woman she had dismissed with a glance, had shattered that illusion. She still couldn't believe it. Claire, of all people, standing there, reading aloud from a letter that seemed so personal, so intimate. Rebecca had thought Claire was just another worker, someone to serve drinks and clear plates. She had underestimated her, and now that very woman had done something that Rebecca could never have imagined. She had exposed her own insecurities, her own flaws, and worse, she had made Rebecca look like the one who had no control. Rebecca's mind raced with fury, but beneath it all, There was a deep discomfort that she couldn't shake. She had never been made to feel small before. She had always been in control. And now, Claire had taken that control, not through aggression, but through quiet strength. The power of her words had unsettled Rebecca in a way nothing else ever had. Back in the kitchen, Claire leaned against the counter, breathing in the familiar scent of dish soap and the soft whir of the dishwasher in the background. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, but at the same time, she felt a kind of peace settling over her. She had done what needed to be done. She had stood her ground. Elaine entered the kitchen, her hands still wet from washing dishes, her eyes glinting with pride as she looked at Claire. She had seen the change in her, the quiet but steady transformation. And though Elaine had never been the one to share her emotions freely, tonight, she couldn't help but acknowledge what Claire had done. "You did good," Elaine said, her voice firm but full of admiration. "You really did. I can't say I've ever seen anyone take control of a room like that." Claire smiled softly, her exhaustion still evident in her posture. "I didn't know I could do it," she admitted. I guess I've been holding this all in for so long. I didn't know how much it had been weighing on me until I said it out loud." Elaine chuckled softly, leaning against the counter next to Claire. "Sometimes, it takes a little nudge to get us to speak up. The thing is, you've been underestimated your whole life, Claire, but you've always had it in you. You just needed to realize it." Claire's smile deepened. It wasn't just the validation from Elaine that she craved. It was the sense of ownership over her own identity. She had been living for others for so long that she hadn't realized how much of herself she had hidden away. Tonight had been the first time she had allowed herself to be seen, and though it had been terrifying, it had also been freeing. "I don't think I'm done yet," Claire said softly, her voice reflecting a new sense of purpose. "I think I've only just begun." Elaine nodded, her eyes warm. "Don't stop now, kid. You've got something bigger inside you than you realize. Don't let anyone, especially Rebecca, make you forget that." As Claire returned to her small apartment later that night, the weight of the evening began to settle more deeply within her. The city outside was quiet now, the soft hum of traffic and distant voices fading as she made her way up the stairs to her apartment. She let herself into the small space, the door creaking as it swung open. The apartment felt different tonight, larger, somehow, though it hadn't changed at all. The walls, the furniture, the faint smell of coffee and old books. It was the same, but she was different. Claire went to the window and looked out over the city. The lights twinkled in the distance, a million small points of light, each one representing someone's life, someone's journey. She thought of her mother then, the woman who had always been the one to see the worth in others when no one else would. The woman who had made Claire believe that strength wasn't about being loud or dominating the room, but about enduring. And now, Claire has done more than endure. She had claimed her place. Her mother had always told her, "Your worth is not determined by how others see you, but by how you see yourself." The quiet rebellion Claire had just begun to embrace wasn't just a defiance of Rebecca. It was a defiance of every person who had ever told her she wasn't enough. It was a defiance of the voice inside her own head that told her she wasn't worthy of more. She had carried that voice for so long, but now, she was beginning to silence it. The next day, Claire went into work as usual. The events of the night before had stayed with her, lingering in the back of her mind, but she didn't let them consume her. She had made her stand, and now it was time to move forward. Rebecca didn't show up for the lunch shift. In fact, she hadn't shown up at all for the rest of the week. Claire didn't know where she had gone or what had happened behind closed doors, but she suspected that whatever it wasn't something Rebecca was willing to confront directly. The days passed, and the restaurant slowly returned to normal. The normal rhythms of work. The endless dance of food and drink, orders and complaints, laughter and sighs, filled the space again. But Claire wasn't the same. She felt like she had broken through something, like she had crossed a line and now, there was no going back. And while Rebecca's absence was curious, Claire wasn't sure it mattered. She had taken her power back, and that was what counted. The days that followed the wedding rehearsal dinner were filled with a strange, quiet energy. Claire hadn't expected the reaction that had followed her decision to take the mic and speak out. After years of silently bearing the weight of other people's judgments, she'd finally given voice to her worth, and it felt like the world had paused for a moment, taking note. But the strange thing was, no one had really said anything directly. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of admiration. Instead, there was a subtle shift, like the slow movement of tides beneath the surface. It was something Claire felt more than saw. A shift in how people treated her, in the way they spoke to her, and most importantly, in how she saw herself. She walked into the restaurant every day with a newfound confidence that was foreign, yet welcome. The old sense of invisibility, that heavy weight she'd carried for so long, had lifted, replaced with something more freeing. It was like she had been holding her breath for years, and now she could finally exhale. Her co-workers, those who had once barely acknowledged her or had treated her like part of the furniture, now seemed to offer her quiet respect. Elaine, who had always been kind but distant, would catch her eye in passing and offer a knowing smile. It wasn't anything overt, but it was enough. The way they nodded to her when she entered the kitchen, the way they made space for her during prep, all of it felt different now. She wasn't just a part of the scenery anymore. She was seen. Even the regular customers noticed. Mr. Jennings, the elderly man who always sat by the window and ordered the same chicken pot pie, had started chatting with her more. He had always been friendly, but there was something in his gaze now that hadn't been there before. An understanding, perhaps, that Claire was not the quiet, unremarkable waitress who had served him for years. She was something more, and in his own gentle way, he let her know it. When Claire made her way through the dining room, she no longer felt the need to shrink herself. Her back was straighter, her movements more deliberate, but still grounded in the same humility that had always been a part of her. There were no more apologies for taking up space. She didn't apologize for existing anymore. The shift wasn't just internal. There were small, subtle changes in how people treated her. The manager, who had once overlooked her in favor of more polished staff members, now asked for her input. He even complimented her on how well she had handled the chaos of the dinner service during the wedding week. It wasn't much, but for Claire, it was everything. He saw her, and for the first time, she realized how much she had longed for that validation. It wasn't about the praise, though, it was about the acknowledgement. For once, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a part of the team, her contributions recognized and valued. Despite the subtle shifts in her work life, Claire often found herself reflecting on the night of the rehearsal dinner. That moment had felt like the culmination of years of silent suffering, years of enduring. But it had also been the beginning of something new. Claire hadn't known it at the time, but when she stood in front of the mic and read her mother's will, she wasn't just speaking those words aloud for others to hear. She was speaking to herself. The room had gone silent, and Claire had felt like she was living in a dream. Her mother's words, written years ago, had suddenly come alive. You are not invisible. Your worth is not determined by how others see you, but by how you see yourself. As she had spoken those words, Claire felt a quiet power rise inside her. She had never imagined it would be this simple. To stand up, to speak her truth, and to allow herself to be seen. And yet, at that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in her life, Claire had felt like she was in control. Not of others, but of herself. The judgment, the rejection, the years of being overlooked, they no longer had power over her. It was a realization that came with an incredible weight, and yet, it felt like the most freeing moment of her life. But there was also a deep sadness that lingered beneath that freedom. She thought about her mother, the woman who had taught her how to rise above, how to endure, and how to find dignity in every small task. Her mother had never gotten the chance to stand in the light the way Claire had. She had never gotten the opportunity to speak her truth to the world. But Claire had, and that felt like a kind of tribute, a way to honor the quiet strength her mother had passed on to her. As Claire continued to reflect on the shift within her, she began to notice that this quiet triumph wasn't just about how others saw her. It was about how she saw herself. She no longer doubted her worth. She no longer questioned whether she deserved to be seen. She was seen, and that realization, though it had come slowly, began to settle deeply into her bones. Her mind wandered back to the years spent in silence, to the moments when she had felt small, when she had allowed others to diminish her sense of self. There had been times when she had believed the stories people told about her, that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't worthy of attention or respect. But those days are over now. Claire understood, for the first time, that she was the one who defined her worth. No one else. Not Rebecca, not the customers who had walked past her without a second glance, and not even the mirror that had reflected back a woman she had never fully understood. She understood it now. She was enough. She had always been enough. The real test of this newfound strength came when Rebecca unexpectedly walked into the restaurant a few days later. Claire had just finished her shift and was sitting in the break room, going through some paperwork when the door opened. At first, Claire didn't recognize her. Rebecca looked different, flustered, almost fragile, her usual perfect exterior cracked. She was standing in the doorway, looking like a woman who had been caught in the middle of something she couldn't control. Her eyes met Claire's, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence stretched on, neither of them sure of what to say next. But for Claire, the silence didn't carry the same weight it used to. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice quieter than Claire had ever heard it. I wanted to apologize." Claire raised an eyebrow, surprised but not moved by the gesture. "For what?" "For how I treated you," Rebecca said, her voice catching slightly. "I was rude. I didn't mean to. I guess I just..." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Claire stood up slowly, taking a moment to consider the apology. There was no anger inside her anymore. She had let go of the bitterness, the resentment that had once filled her heart. Instead, she simply nodded. "I'm not the one you owe an apology to," Claire said softly, her voice steady. "But I appreciate the words. You don't need to apologize to me. I've learned to move past things like that." Rebecca looked at her, surprised by the calmness in Claire's voice. "I'm sorry, really. I know I hurt you." Claire shook her head. "You didn't hurt me. You just didn't see me. And that's okay. I'm not invisible anymore." That conversation, brief and simple as it was, marked another turning point for Claire. The apology, though sincere, no longer held the power it might have once had over her. She had already made peace with herself. She had already taken back her power. As the days passed, the subtle changes continued. People at work treated her differently, but it was Claire herself who had changed the most. She no longer felt the need to apologize for her presence. She was no longer afraid of taking up space, of being heard. There was a quiet strength in that, a power that came from within, not from the validation of others. Claire had learned to stand on her own, to rise above the opinions of those who had once tried to diminish her. And that quiet power, though it was still new, still unfolding, was something that would stay with her no matter what came next. The days following her stand at the wedding rehearsal dinner were a blur of ordinary moments. But within those moments, Claire could feel the subtle power of her change. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the woman who shrank into the background, whose value was measured by how well she served others, how quietly she moved through the world. Something had shifted, and though the world around her hadn't dramatically changed overnight, Claire knew she had. She was no longer bound by the limitations others had placed on her, nor the ones she had placed on herself. Every morning, as Claire prepared for work, she took a moment in front of the mirror, looking at herself in a way she never had before. The woman staring back at her was different, not because of any physical change, but because of the confidence that radiated from her. The past few weeks had been a revelation. The rejection, the humiliation, the dismissal, all of it had led to this moment. And now, Claire felt ready to embrace the world, to carve out a space for herself that wasn't defined by others' expectations. But the transformation wasn't without its challenges. Claire had always been a woman who valued solitude. She was used to moving through life with a certain quietness, tucked away in the background of everything, watching but never fully participating. She hadn't realized how much of that solitude had been tied to her own internalized belief that she wasn't worthy of being seen. Now that she had broken free from that, she found herself facing a new kind of pressure. The pressure to maintain this new version of herself. At first, it had been liberating. She had walked into the restaurant the morning after the wedding rehearsal with her head held high, the weight of the past few days still heavy on her shoulders, but a different kind of heaviness, one that felt empowering. She had held on to that sense of power all week. But now, with each passing day, Claire was beginning to understand the difficulty of maintaining the confidence she had worked so hard to build. It wasn't something that came easily, not when the old habits of doubting herself, of shrinking, still whispered in her ear. As she moved through the motions of her daily life, Claire found herself constantly reflecting on the changes she had made. She realized that the process of transformation wasn't something that happened all at once. It was an ongoing journey, one that required constant effort and self-awareness. The more she looked inward, the more she realized that it wasn't just about what others saw in her. It was about how she saw herself. And that was a far more complicated process than she had anticipated. The most difficult part of Claire's growth was confronting the parts of herself she had hidden for so long. There were scars, both visible and invisible, that she had carried with her throughout her life, scars of rejection, of being overlooked, of feeling like she was never enough. Those scars were still there, buried beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen after a particularly busy lunch shift, Claire found herself thinking about her mother. June had always been the one who held their world together, who had taught Claire the importance of resilience, of enduring, of never letting the world see how much it hurt. But June had also kept her own pain hidden, and Claire had never fully understood the depth of that burden until now. When her mother had passed away, Claire had been consumed with the practicalities of life, the funeral, the paperwork, the bills. She had thrown herself into that, burying her grief and pushing aside the pain of losing her mother. But now, as she stood in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, she realized just how much she had neglected her own emotional healing. She had never truly processed her mother's death, had never taken the time to mourn properly. Instead, she had thrown herself into work, into surviving. The realization hit Claire with a force she wasn't prepared for. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day, that she had never allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loss. But it wasn't just her mother's death she hadn't fully confronted. It was the years of rejection, the years of quiet humiliation, the years of being overlooked, all of it. It had all piled up, and Claire had never allowed herself the space to truly grieve. She wasn't sure how to begin this healing process, but she knew it had to start with one thing: forgiveness. She had spent so many years blaming herself for the ways she had been treated, for the ways she had allowed others to make her feel small. But she couldn't keep carrying that burden. It wasn't hers to bear anymore. That evening, after the dinner rush had died down and the last few customers had trickled out, Claire found herself sitting with Elaine in the quiet of the kitchen. The older woman was cleaning up, her hands moving automatically, but her eyes were focused on Claire. Elaine had always been a quiet observer, and tonight was no different. "You've been quiet," Elaine said, her voice soft but knowing. "I can tell something's been weighing on you." Claire hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. She had never been good at expressing her feelings, at letting others see the cracks beneath her tough exterior. But tonight, she felt different. She felt like she could be open. "I think I've been running from my grief," Claire admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so focused on moving forward, on building myself up, that I've never really dealt with everything I've lost." Elaine set down the dish she was holding and looked at Claire, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's not easy to let yourself feel those things. I think we all have a tendency to hide from our pain, to bury it. But if you don't take the time to heal, it's always going to be there, lurking in the background." Claire nodded slowly, absorbing Elaine's words. It was the first time she had truly acknowledged how much pain she had been carrying, how much she had been hiding from. And as much as it scared her, she knew she couldn't keep running from it. "I don't know where to start," Claire said, the vulnerability in her voice clear. "How do you even begin to heal from something like this?" Elaine sighed softly, her gaze turning distant as she seemed to reflect on her own experiences. "You start small," she said finally. "You allow yourself the space to feel. You don't rush it, but you don't ignore it either. And you forgive yourself, Claire. Forgive yourself for the things you couldn't control, for the things you thought you should have done differently. The past is behind you. The only thing you can change is right here, right now." Claire looked at Elaine, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the older woman's wisdom. It was as if she had opened a door that Claire had been afraid to walk through. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she felt like she had the strength to start healing. As the weeks passed, Claire found herself slowly taking the steps toward healing. She started allowing herself the space to grieve. Grieve for her mother, for the years she had spent being unseen, for the pain of rejection she had carried with her for so long. It wasn't easy. Some days it felt like the weight of it all would swallow her whole. But little by little, the healing process began. And as Claire took those steps, she also took ownership of her newfound strength. She didn't wait for others to validate her anymore. She didn't seek out approval. She had become her own source of validation, her own source of strength. The woman who had once hidden in the shadows had stepped into the light, and she was beginning to understand what it meant to truly live. In the days to come, the echoes of her past would continue to linger, but they no longer held the power they once did. Claire was no longer bound by the past. She was free to move forward, to build a life that reflected the woman she had become, strong, resilient, and unapologetically herself. The days seemed to stretch longer now, each one feeling like a quiet affirmation of the shift Claire had undergone. She walked through her days with a calm that was new to her, a sense of inner stillness that had once seemed unreachable. There were moments when she felt a quiet energy radiating from within, as though every step she took was being guided by something stronger than herself, something she had been holding inside her all along. It had been weeks since the wedding rehearsal dinner, since that pivotal moment when she had stood before the room and read the letter from her mother. At the time, it had felt like a one-time act, a moment of defiance, of finally being heard. But as the days passed, Claire realized it wasn't just about that moment. It was about the change it had sparked in her. She was no longer the same person who had walked into that restaurant. She had crossed some invisible threshold, and she was moving forward, every step grounding her in her newfound truth. Each day, the weight of her transformation became more palpable. She was no longer battling the doubts and insecurities that had once held her back. She had stopped questioning her right to take up space, to be seen, to speak. And in the quiet moments, when she reflected on the changes in her life, Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for what she had gained, even as she mourned the parts of herself she had left behind. The most profound shift Claire noticed wasn't just in how others treated her. It was in how she began to treat herself. The first few weeks after the dinner had been filled with a rush of emotion, a whirlwind of new interactions, and a deep, exhausting kind of change. But now, she was learning to sit with herself in a new way. It was in the stillness, the quiet moments between shifts, when she found her greatest source of strength. Before, Claire had been afraid of silence. It was in those quiet moments that she would question herself, replaying every interaction, every mistake, every moment where she had felt inadequate. But now, as she sat in the small break room at work or walked alone through the city streets, Claire found a different kind of peace in that silence. It was no longer a space of self-doubt. It was a space of reflection and growth. She had learned to embrace it. The moments when she was alone, when no one was watching, were no longer uncomfortable. They had become opportunities for her to check in with herself, to ask herself, "Am I still moving forward?" She would answer herself with a quiet nod, a sense of peace that came from within. While Claire had shifted internally, she was also keenly aware of how others were reacting to her transformation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like the world had suddenly fallen at her feet. It was the subtle changes, the way people looked at her differently, the way they began to listen to her when she spoke, when she gave her input at work, when she shared her thoughts with friends. She could feel it in the way people interacted with her now. There was respect, where there had once been disregard. Elaine, always a quiet observer, had become her confidant. The two women spent hours together, often after closing time, cleaning the kitchen or sitting on the back porch, talking about everything and nothing. There was an understanding between them now, something that went deeper than friendship. It was as if they had both witnessed something transformative, not just in Claire, but in themselves. One evening, as they were both finishing up a late shift, Elaine looked at Claire with a mixture of affection and curiosity. "You've changed," she said quietly, almost as though she was speaking to herself. Claire looked up, surprised by the directness of the statement. "I have, haven't I?" Elaine nodded. "You've always had that quiet strength in you, but now it's like you've realized it." Claire smiled softly, her eyes meeting Elaine's. "I think I'm just starting to understand it, what I'm capable of, what I deserve." As Claire continued to grow in her understanding of her own worth, she also began to realize something else. How much of her life had been spent living for others. She had spent so much time trying to please people, trying to win their approval, trying to fit into their expectations. But now, as she stood in the kitchen, making the same familiar motions she had made 1,000 times before, she realized that none of that had mattered. She had spent years shrinking herself, making herself small so that others could feel comfortable. But she didn't need to do that anymore. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind. "You are not invisible." The more Claire internalized that truth, the more she understood that her worth was not contingent on the approval of others. Her worth was inherent, born from within. And as she walked through life, carrying that understanding with her, she realized that she had the power to decide what her life would be. She was no longer bound by the opinions of those around her. That was the quiet revolution Claire had experienced. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was real. It was a shift that no one could take away from her. Despite the silent triumph Claire had experienced, the absence of Rebecca weighed on her in ways she hadn't expected. Claire had seen the fear in Rebecca's eyes after the dinner, the unspoken acknowledgement of having been exposed. But that fear had been a reflection of Rebecca's own insecurities, her own need to control the narrative. And while Claire didn't know the details, she suspected that Rebecca wasn't the type to confront her feelings head-on. It was odd, though. There had been a time when Claire would have been consumed by Rebecca's absence. She would have wondered what had happened, why Rebecca hadn't come back to work. But now, Claire realized that her life no longer revolved around Rebecca's actions or reactions. For the first time, Claire's focus was on her own life, on the choices she was making, on the way she was building herself up. She had spent so many years defining herself by how others saw her. But now, she saw the truth. Rebecca was just a character in her story, not the author of it. And in that realization, Claire found a deep sense of freedom. The changes in Claire weren't just internal. They were showing up in her external world as well. She found that people were approaching her differently, offering her opportunities she might have once thought impossible. One day, after a particularly busy shift, the restaurant manager pulled her aside. "Claire, I've been thinking about you," he said, his tone more serious than usual. "I want to offer you a promotion. There's an opening for a lead server position. I think you'd be great for it." Claire blinked, surprised. She had been working in the same position for years, quietly moving through the ranks. But she had never expected something like this. Something that acknowledged her efforts, her experience, and her growth. "I thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I'd be honored." It wasn't just the promotion that mattered. It was the recognition, the acknowledgement that she had earned something through her own hard work. It was the validation of her efforts, her quiet strength, and it felt like a reflection of everything she had worked to build. As Claire walked out of the restaurant that evening, the air cooler than it had been in weeks, she realized something. Her future was no longer defined by the limitations of her past. She had created a space for herself, one where she was no longer invisible, no longer small. She had taken control of her own narrative, and that narrative was still unfolding. For the first time, Claire felt ready for whatever came next. She was no longer afraid of standing tall, of claiming her space. She had learned that her worth was hers to define, that her power came from within, and that nothing, not Rebecca's dismissal, not anyone's judgments, could take that away from her. Claire walked down the street, her footsteps steady, her heart full of quiet confidence. She was no longer just moving through life. She was living it. The evening had settled into the quiet hum of a world at rest. The city streets outside Claire's apartment, once bustling with the usual din of cars, foot traffic, and the endless pulse of life, now felt peaceful, almost serene. Claire sat by the window, looking out at the city, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The apartment, once a place she came home to only for rest between long shifts, now felt like a sanctuary. It was a space she had created not just with her belongings, but with her newfound sense of self. She had spent years running, pushing herself to move from one day to the next without pausing to truly appreciate what was around her. But tonight, Claire took the time. The stillness of the room was like a balm, soothing the edges of her mind, the quiet space to reflect. Her journey, her transformation, had been a long and often painful one. But tonight, as she sat there, looking out over the city she had always lived in, she knew it had been worth it. Every struggle, every moment of fear, every tear she had shed had led her to this place. Claire allowed herself to feel the fullness of the quiet. It wasn't the silence of loneliness or rejection. It was the silence of peace. The weight she had carried for so long, the heavy burden of feeling unseen, of thinking she wasn't enough, was finally gone. And now, at this moment, she has had enough. The last few months had been filled with change. Claire had stepped out from the shadows of her own doubts and allowed herself to be seen. It had begun with that moment at the rehearsal dinner when she had stood up, taken the mic, and read aloud her mother's will. She had no idea how much that moment would change her. She had no idea that, by sharing the words her mother had left behind, she would awaken something deep inside herself. When she read the letter, Claire hadn't just been speaking to the room. She had been speaking to herself. She had been reminding herself of the truth her mother had tried to instill in her, that her worth wasn't determined by the world's perception, but by how she saw herself. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't small. She was worthy of being seen, of taking up space, of owning her voice. Looking back, Claire understood now that the road to self-empowerment had never been about grand gestures or dramatic change. It had been about learning to accept herself in every form, flaws, imperfections, and all. It had been about shedding the layers of self-doubt and stepping into her true self, unapologetically. Tonight, she understood the magnitude of what she had done. Standing in front of the room, reading her mother's words, had been more than just an act of defiance. It had been an act of self-liberation. Claire had set herself free that night, and the world, despite its attempts to diminish her, could no longer hold her back. Claire stood and walked to the small mirror hanging in her apartment's hallway. It was the same mirror she had looked into for years, the one that reflected the woman she had always been, the woman who had lived with a sense of quiet resignation. But tonight, when Claire gazed into it, she saw something different. For the first time, Claire saw herself as she truly was. Not the quiet waitress who had always kept her head down. Not the woman who had tried to shrink in order to make others feel comfortable. She saw a woman who had weathered storms, who had learned to rise above the judgment of others, and most importantly, who had learned to see her own worth. Her reflection wasn't just the face of a woman who had endured. It was the face of a woman who had grown. There was a quiet strength in her eyes now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The woman staring back at her in the mirror was someone who had claimed her own story. She was no longer a passive participant in her life. She was the author of it. Claire smiled at her reflection, a smile that was full of understanding, full of self-compassion. She had earned this peace, and it felt good. The changes in Claire weren't just internal anymore. She was beginning to see the ripple effect in the world around her. It wasn't just the way she moved through her job at the restaurant now, it was the way she interacted with the people around her. There was a new clarity to her presence, an ease that hadn't existed before. Elaine, who had become one of her closest confidants, noticed the difference in Claire too. Over the past few weeks, They had spent more time together outside of work, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't just the typical small talk they used to share. It was deeper now. They talked about their hopes, their regrets, their shared understanding of what it meant to be a woman in a world that often tried to define them. And in each conversation, Claire found herself growing more comfortable with the idea that she wasn't just living for herself. She was living for the woman she had always wanted to become. One night, after another long shift, Elaine handed her a small, neatly wrapped gift as Claire was about to leave. "I've been meaning to give this to you," Elaine said with a gentle smile. Claire looked at the package curiously and slowly unwrapped it. Inside, she found a small framed photograph, one of herself, taken during her early days working at the restaurant. It was a picture from a busy night, when she had been working a double shift and had looked so young and tired. But in that picture, Claire could see something she hadn't noticed before. A spark in her eyes, a quiet determination even back then. Elaine's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I want you to have this. You were always more than you knew, and I think it's time you saw that." Claire blinked, her throat tightening. She hadn't realized until that moment just how much she had been holding on to the belief that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't worthy of recognition. But this moment with Elaine, the small gesture of kindness, made her realize that she had always been worthy. She had always been enough. "Thank you," Claire said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I think I'm finally starting to see it." As Claire stepped into the restaurant the following day, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as though something new was on the horizon. She had no idea what the future held, whether it was another promotion, a new relationship, or simply a continuation of the quiet peace she had found within herself. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel afraid of what was to come. She had faced the hardest parts of her journey already. She had confronted the pain of her past, the fear of rejection, and the constant self-doubt that had plagued her for years. She had faced those fears head-on and had emerged stronger, more self-aware, and ready to embrace whatever came next. As she walked to the back of the restaurant, she couldn't help but smile. The world had changed around her, yes, but the biggest shift had happened within her. The woman who had once been invisible was no longer hiding in the shadows. She had stepped into the light, and now the world would have to see her for who she truly was. With every step, Claire knew she was no longer just moving through life. She was living it, and that was the greatest triumph of all.